Hello, welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club program. My name's Jonathan Swan, political reporter for the New York Times. It's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Karl, chief Washington correspondent for ABC News, co-anchor of This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and author of the new book, Tired of Winning, Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party. Jonathan has known Donald Trump longer than any other White House correspondent and covered his historic rise as president, as well as the political and legal aftermath from the 2020 election. Jonathan, I want to start with reading a message from Donald Trump about you.
Okay, good.
It's dated November the 15th, so it's about a month ago. Failed ABC fake news reporter Jonathan Karl just wrote another bad book. He works so hard, 3 O's on so, but has so little talent. Some people have it and some people don't. I'm not going to read the rest of the message, but tell me what something in this really irritated him. Of all the things in your book, and you know, you really catalog, you know, Donald Trump's efforts to subvert the election, you know, explicit sort of flirtations with Confederate imagery and iconography, vengeance. What was the thing that really bothered him most about your book?
I mean, the book is a grim portrayal. I think it's a very fair portrayal because it is based on the facts. Almost all of what is in there is derived from information that I received talking to people who served him, people that were close to him. I mean, virtually every source in that book is a Republican, most of them Republicans who at one point or another, and some cases still do, support Donald Trump. But yes, no, it wasn't the fact that I talked about how the first campaign rally of his campaign was in Waco, Texas, that it was using language from the militia movement that inspired Timothy McVeigh to drive a truck full of explosives to blow up the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995, killing 168 people. It wasn't talking about one of his top outside advisors invoking the Confederate plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln to describe the theme of Trump's 2024 campaign. It wasn't any of that. It was something I reported about Kim Kardashian. Seriously, that is the one thing that Trump has taken issue with in this book. The one and only thing that he has taken issue is some reporting in the book about Kim Kardashian, which, by the way, he doesn't actually dispute. He just wants to dispel me of the idea that he would ever do anything because Kim Kardashian wanted him to do something. Mm-hmm. That if you know, he would listen to Kanye West, but he wouldn't listen to Kim Kardashian.
And I thought it was quite revealing that the thing that bothered him was the implication that sports stars didn't want to come to the White House. That this was the thing that got under.
And by the way, I mean, this is not like a major thing in the book, but it's a very interesting and revealing anecdote. This is at the end. January 6th happens. If you remember, Bill Belichick, he had given the Medal of Freedom, and Belichick was supposed to be coming to the White House to accept it, the great Patriots head coach. And Belichick canceled on him. Too toxic, put out a statement saying the country is too divided. I'm not going to come to the White House. So Trump, being desperate to show up Belichick, Kim Kardashian had reached out to him seeking clemency for a list of people. You know, she, of course, was very involved in getting the pardon for Alice Johnson. She's somebody who's taken on this criminal justice reform. And his answer to her was, well, you get me some of your football player friends to the White House and I'll do something, but you got to get me that. And she actually tried to do it and none of them would come. That's how toxic Trump was in the final 2 weeks of his presidency.
Jonathan, you wrote 2 books on Trump before this. Both were bestsellers. The second one was very dark, as you know, for obvious reasons. It cataloged his efforts to overturn the election, the period that led up to and followed January 6th. What was the origin story of this book? Was it planned after? Did you always have a thought that you would do a third one? How did you come to do this book?
When I wrote Betrayal, my previous book, I really did think that would be the last thing I would ever write about Donald Trump. So this was not it was not something I immediately planned. In fact, Betrayal, the subtitle is The Final Act of the Trump Show. And I wrote that book because I wanted to get down for history exactly what had happened in the lead up to January 6th. I wanted to get down to the best I can while memories were fresh, go and talk to everybody who was there and tell the story of 2020, the election, the COVID disaster, and how it all culminated in January 6th. So I thought that was the end. And then, I sometime in 2021, I decided that there's another story to write, but it's not the story that I ended up writing. My original idea was to essentially describe, the sad and lonely demise of a disgraced ex-president. What it was like to go back, to lose all of that power, to be an outcast, from his party and from his former friends. And he was really in quite a mode. I interviewed him a couple of times over the course of 2021, and which was including the last interview was really for kind of the very end before Betrayal went to press. And it just struck me that was kind of your story. What's it like to have exile in Mar-a-Lago? This glorious exile where he's playing DJ on the patio out back, and most of his former anybody that was with him in the White House has basically flown the coop. He's not even his family seems to have as much to do with him. And then Jonathan, as I'm writing the story, he recaptures the mantle of the Republican Party. He becomes the dominant figure, the presumptive frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination once again. So it became a very different story. But that's how. I mean, I had toyed with the idea of calling the book The Biggest Loser. There's a chapter called The Biggest Loser about the 2022 elections, but it became a very different story. And where Betrayal was to try to get the history down, this one was more of to a degree is more forward looking, even though it describes in detail what happened to get us here. It's a warning about what could be coming if he returns to power.
Just to stay with that period, I think it's funny. It struck me reading the book. It's hard to remember just how much of a pariah Donald Trump was after January 6th, and really how the party. I mean, I talked to so many Republicans, I know you did too, at that time, who felt that Donald Trump was over. It was behind him, behind us. Take us back to that period. I mean, you talked to Trump a couple of times, as you said, in 2021, and you did a lot of reporting. What was he thinking, doing, saying in that early period? Like, do you think he ever seriously entertained the idea of not running for president again?
He was obsessed with something else. So I don't think that running again was what was motivating him, what he was doing during this very dark period. I've got a chapter called Dark Days in Mar-a-Lago that describes, what life was like around him during this period. Sure, he had Kevin McCarthy come to visit him famously on January 28th. But even that, McCarthy was very quick to tell people that he was in Florida doing fundraising and he just stopped by, or as Liz Cheney is now reporting, people had said he's not eating. I didn't have that detail, although I did have a story of him getting up and leaving dinner in the middle of dinner, again, out on the patio of Mar-a-Lago, and just everybody's like, what happened? He just left. So he was out of sorts, but he became obsessed over the course of 2021 with the idea that he could actually be reinstated as president, not by winning the next presidential election. And your colleague Maggie Haberman had tweeted something about this at the time, sometime during, I believe it was the summer, that this had been something that he had been thinking about. I don't think anybody took it too seriously. I learned that it was a total obsession with him. He wasn't saying hardly anything about it publicly except for a few cryptic statements, but privately, it was all he wanted to talk about, to the point where one person close to him at Mar-a-Lago said, look, you've got to stop talking about that because people are going to think you're crazy. I think he had just lost touch with reality. This was a QAnon, Mike Lindell. Remember,
Right.
he floated the idea he's going to be reinstated on August 13th. Well, Trump was all in on this thing, and he was in on it long after it didn't happen on August 13th. He was still pushing it into last year.
Did he have, what was his conception of how this would actually work?
Yeah, it was kind of a domino theory. The idea, it really started with the cyber ninjas, as you recall, being they hired to do the recounts, an additional audit out in Arizona. The Arizona Senate Republicans hired this firm that had never done anything like it. Remember, it was a whole sideshow that lasted for months. And OAN, the far right, I don't want to call them a news channel, but the far right, whatever you want to call it, television network, had gotten the rights to do a closed circuit broadcast of the recount, like 24/7. And Trump was watching this thing from his office at Mar-a-Lago. He was talking about it to people who would come. One of the ways you got information about Trump during this time period, besides talking to people, because he had no access to Twitter, he wasn't being interviewed by anybody, he wasn't out there doing public events for the most part, is he would come out, people would have weddings or events at Mar-a-Lago, and he would come out and speak to the crowd, and people would take video with their cell phones and then post it. And sometimes he spoke at length, and he was forever talking about this thing going on in Arizona. But his idea was that the cyber ninjas would prove that Arizona was in fact a total landslide for Trump. And then that would prompt either Georgia or Michigan or Pennsylvania, it didn't matter which, maybe Wisconsin, to do the same thing. And then that would prove that he had really won each one of those states. And then the evidence would be so overwhelming that somehow it would force, hard to know exactly how, the Supreme Court was sometimes invoked, as if the Supreme Court was going to say, wait a minute, Biden out, but this was the thinking. And I asked him about it in July of, it was July 23rd of 2021. So we're just a few weeks away from the August 13 date that Lindell was talking about. And I only asked him because I had called him up to go over some of the things that I was reporting on, to kind of check with him. Always would do that. And he was ranting about, you're seeing all this stuff and you're not going to write about it. You're not going to believe all this stuff that's coming out and people are going to see. And he had a statement, which I'm sure you will recall, but most people won't, that had come out just a few days before, that was ranting about SNL. Okay. It was a rant. Back then, his statements, nobody saw because he didn't even have Truth Social yet. I mean, he was truly, like you said, a guy that was a pariah. He had his website and they would put out statements, and, most people didn't see them. But it ended with the phrase 2024 or before.
Yes, I remember that.
Gratuitously, just at the end.
Right.
So I wasn't even going to ask him about it, but it was just, but then I was like, well, you don't really think you can be reinstated, do you, before the next election? And he tells me, and it's quite, I mean, I don't know if it's sad or if it's comical or if it's nuts, but he says, I would tell you, but you wouldn't understand. You wouldn't understand it. But he was, he was really fixated on this. And as you know, there's something else in the book that I describe, which is Mo Brooks, one of the most hardcore pro-Trump figures in Congress by far, the guy that wore body armor to his rally on January 6th, the guy that there was a move to strip his committee assignments because his rhetoric was so incendiary on January 6th. Trump asked Mo Brooks in early 2022, early last year, to make a public statement calling on his reinstatement as president. And Mo Brooks refused to do it. Mo Brooks thought that was a little nuts.
Right. So Trump he's quite isolated in that period. He's spending a lot of time talking to people like Boris Epshteyn, Mike Lindell, the sort of the Stop the Steal crowd. But there were some rehabilitators from the Republican Party at its highest levels, and you chronicle that. Talk about that, because it is an interesting sort of thought experiment to think about. Well, was it destined that Donald Trump, was it always going to happen, or were there these moments that enabled him to come back as the dominant figure? Of course, we'll never know, and you say that in your book, but talk us through that part of the story.
Well, you're right to come back to how you started this discussion. People have forgotten, or perhaps weren't even fully aware, because he was truly out of the imagination. But it was like he was pushed aside. How much of a pariah he was. And I think there are two very critical moments, two very critical what ifs. The first is the chairwoman of the Republican Party, Ronna McDaniel, who, as I had recounted in Betrayal, had called him on January 20th when Trump was getting on Air Force One for his last 2021, his last ride aboard Air Force One to go home. He left the White House, I think it was about 8:30 in the morning, didn't stick around for the inauguration, didn't want to have any contact with Biden whatsoever. He leaves, has a really pathetically small rally at Andrews Air Force Base, goes up the steps. Ronna McDaniel, who like so many others didn't go, calls him up just to say, hey, thanks for all you did. We accomplished a lot, just a nice farewell call. And he lays into her, puts the phone on speakerphone. Don Jr. is there on that office at the front of Air Force One. And he tells her that he's leaving the Republican Party. Now, there had been reporting on this at the time that Trump was talking about forming a Patriot Party and all this. And, again, you don't know how much of this to take seriously. I mean, at the time, I didn't really think that much of it. But what I learned, very thoroughly reported, is that he said point blank he was going to leave, and that McDaniel was really beside herself and said, if you do that, you're going to hurt all the people that did so much for you, worked so hard for you. You won't win. We won't win. We'll all lose. And he snaps at her and says, you deserve to lose because you, meaning the Republicans, didn't work hard enough. If you had, I'd still be president. And McDaniel goes from pleading with him, pleading to his kind heart and his loyalty to those that have been so loyal to him. That doesn't work. So she basically threatens him, and there's some negotiations that go back and forth for 4 or 5 days, and he backs down. He stays in the Republican Party. So that's one. What would have happened? But just
before you move on, the threat, the substance of the threat is actually really important.
It was money. It was money. It was there were two aspects of it. One, as you recall, the RNC was paying some of his legal bills. So obviously that wasn't going to go away, which she reminded him. But the thing that he had used to make most of his money from the political world was the massive database mailing list of Trump voters, Republican voters. And the way you make money off that is you rent it to other campaigns. So every House candidate, Senate candidate, if you can rent parts of the list, from your district, from your state. And he made a lot of money renting that thing out. And the RNC allowed him to be the one that rented it out. So they said that they were going to make it publicly available for free, which meant nobody would pay a dime anymore to rent it out. And he would lose his primary source at that point of income. So it was money. It was money, and he backed down. And what if she at that point had said, "Go ahead, start your own party"? I mean, it's hard to think about it now from a perspective where he's once again the dominant figure, maybe as much of a hold on the party as ever. To that moment, I mean, who would have gone with him? Certainly, he would have had his core supporters. Would he really have done it? He was from such a weak point. Would he really have followed through on the threat? Who knows? But she could have called his bluff on that. And the other is McCarthy, and McCarthy, who had very little regard for him at this point, and certainly didn't think he was going to be, reemerging the way he has. But McCarthy had two things that he was thinking about. One, obviously he was thinking about becoming Speaker of the House. and knew that if Trump, even in a weakened pariah state, was not supportive, that would be problematic. But more importantly, he's looking to the midterm elections and thinking that Republicans need a big turnout to win back the House. And if Trump is not fully on board, his people aren't going to be turning out. And he's also thinking of, the help that Trump can provide raising small donor money.
Mm-hmm.
So, he's thinking just not that I need to pay allegiance to Trump and invite him back in to be the leader of the party again, but we need to have him part of the team if I'm going to be successful going into the midterms and if I'm going to be successful after we win the House in becoming speaker. So what if McCarthy had just blown him off and just ignored him? I mean, McConnell had done that. I mean, McConnell had said, the criminal justice system can deal with him now. I mean, what if McCarthy? So those are two key what if moments, I think, for the Republican Party. Now, maybe McDaniel would have been, cast aside, and maybe McCarthy's career would have been over and he never would have been speaker. I don't know. I mean, that speaker thing didn't work out that great for him anyway.
You don't think so?
I mean, those 2022 elections, I don't know that Trump was that great a force for them. Do you think so? I mean, what a disaster. What if at that moment, just rip off the Band-Aid and say, you know what? Thanks. Goodbye.
What's really interesting about that, just listening to you talk about that and reading in your book, is there's sort of two elements to it. There's fear. They still feared what he could do, but there was also complacency. And these people, and it wasn't just those two, it was, I think, I talked to a lot of different Republican members of Congress, senators, et cetera, party leaders. They all were operating under the assumption that Donald Trump would never have a chance of being the nominee of the party ever again, that his political days were, it was just accepted wisdom. And they were operating with that as their baseline, and everything was premised with that as the baseline. So, I mean, just another counterfactual I've been thinking about a lot recently, is McConnell. I mean, I just wonder, and we may never exactly know the real truth about what he thinks, but I do wonder the extent to which he's now second guessing his impeachment vote. Votes like that could have also changed history.
As it was the New York Times, I believe, that kind of jolted the political order with a story as the impeachment trial was approaching,
that he was seriously considering
voting guilty. And I'm sure you were doing the same thing. I remember getting out my list and counting Republicans and seeing you needed 17 to vote guilty. And I could just about get there. If McConnell wins, you had these institutionalists who would have been largely with McConnell. I mean, It was very hard. It was very close. But obviously once McConnell takes his stand, there's no way that, the Thunes and the Cornyn's and the Grassleys and those kind of people are going to vote guilty while McConnell is voting not guilty. But yeah, I think that's a great question too. Again, because what could have come with a guilty verdict is a prohibition on running ever again for public office.
Right. So we fast forward. He does run for president. One of the core themes of your book is retribution as a motivating force, and I think it's spot on. I think it really is a deep motivating force. He's not making a secret about it. He said it out loud. But just talk about that, how that desire for retribution has colored his thinking as he runs for president a third time.
So he announced that he was running for president on November 15th of last year, 2022. It was just a week after Republicans had that horribly disappointing midterm elections. And everybody around him, with the exception of just a couple of people, were urging him not to announce he was running. It's like, you can run, but just don't announce now. This is a very bad time. Let the dust settle, wait. And he goes forward with the announcement, and he gives a speech at Mar-a-Lago. I was there. one of the many things striking about this announcement in the ballroom at Mar-a-Lago was how few people were there. I mean, there were plenty of the seats were all filled, but there were none of the people that you think of as the Trump brain trust, the key figures from his White House, the key figures from his 2016 or 2020 campaign. None of them were there. None of the campaign managers, none of the chiefs of staff, not a single confirmed cabinet member. There were only 2 members of Congress who even bothered to show up. And one of them was Madison Cawthorn, who was about to become a non-member because he had lost a Republican primary. I mean, it was like nobody wanted anything to do with it, but he gave a speech and I remember Jason Miller being rather proud of the fact that the speech was not going to be a grievance tour of 2020, because you remember the discussion
Sure.
of the midterms was all this talk about stolen election is what dragged Republicans. So he didn't get into that in that speech. It was a kind of a policy speech.
He looked bored as he was.
He hated it. It was like he was. It was just terrible.
Totally.
And there was no talk of retribution. It was like, we're going to go back and we're going to really drain the swamp this time. And, I mean, it was just
energy independence.
Yeah. And if you remember, for the next couple of months, almost a full couple of months, if you looked at the polls, it was Ron DeSantis that was on top in a hypothetical matchup, because DeSantis hadn't declared he was running yet. There was a Wall Street Journal poll on December 14th, I believe, of 2022 that had DeSantis in the 50s, Trump in the 30s. I mean, this did not look like a guy that was gonna win. The rebirth of the campaign, though, came, and I think Steve Bannon was a big influence here. But it came when he addressed CPAC in the spring of 2023, gave a 2-hour long speech that's one of the darkest campaign speeches that has ever happened anywhere. That lays out, that's where he uses that famous line in 2016, I said, I am your voice. Now I say, I am your retribution. And it outlines this, we are going to go and we are going to root out. He doesn't use the word vermin, but everything else. Right. We're going to root out the deep state. We're going to utterly annihilate and destroy, our enemies and the people that have come after me, because they really want to go after you. And that becomes the theme of his campaign. He hadn't been indicted yet, but it was clear the indictments were coming. Jack Smith was well underway. There were all kinds of, people were expecting something to come out of New York and the DA, even Georgia, which would come quite a while later. But the indictments were coming, and as they came, this has become the central theme of his campaign, which is, this kind of, there's not a lot of specificity to it, but we're going to utterly destroy our enemies within our own government, our domestic enemies. I think I get the sense that he's primarily talking about Republicans who used to be with him, but were now against him. And then maybe after that, prosecutors, FBI, anybody who's been involved in any of the legal cases against him. And then after that, oh, by the way, Democrats, Joe Biden.
What is your reporting and just your knowledge of his psychology tell you about what we should expect next year when he's likely in court for at least one criminal trial during the election season? What do you expect to see there?
Defining a defining characteristic for Trump, I mean, again, before he got into politics, but certainly since you and I have been covering him as a political figure, is his unpredictability, his volatility. He's mercurial. He goes up, he goes down. He changes course. People try to keep up with him. He's by the gut. He's not particularly strategic. It's all, in the moment. But I think that he is actually more volatile now than he's ever been. And we don't get as much of a sense of that, because we see much less of him now. And that's starting to change as we see him out. And as it's starting to change, by the way, just look at the storyline over the last, couple of weeks when he is, coming out and he's talking about January 6th prisoners as hostages. He's talking about his enemies as vermin, kind of using, Third Reich imagery. He's, every day there's something else that seems to go further. He's talking about prosecuting his enemies. So I don't really know. I don't think that we know what we're in for. And I think that the idea that this is going to be a kind of a slow, steady campaign where he's going to accumulate delegates and then win the nomination and then, have a couple of big debates against Biden and give a bunch of incendiary speeches. No, I'm fearful about what the next year is going to look like. And I'm also completely humbled. I don't think I can predict. I don't think I can predict what he's going to be like and what his psychology will be like as he's sitting through these cases. I mean, let's just look at
the thing I find, like, I think about it all the time, and when I'm doing my reporting on Trump right now, is if we assume, we can't assume anything, but if we assume that there will be a January 6th trial in Washington, D.C. next year, and let's say for purposes of conversation that that's the only trial, all the rest of them get delayed.
Yeah.
He will be in a courtroom every day for 3 months, maybe, from early April, maybe to sort of or late March to maybe mid-July, and there won't be cameras broadcasting it. So I think so much, and your book kind of gets into the sort of the way he warps the information space, but you just got to you roll the tape forward in our minds. It'll be Trump in a courtroom. He'll leave the courtroom every day, do a sort of wave the bloody shirt press conference on the courthouse steps every day. I'm Nelson Mandela. Joe Biden's trying to lock me up. This is like a third banana republic, blah, blah, blah. Gets in his motorcade with the dashboard cam, OJ style kind of news coverage to the airport, flies home to Trump Tower, sleeps there, comes back, repeat, repeat, repeat. And one thing I sort of am thinking a lot about is what effect this has on the public, because the only person who's in the courtroom as a participant that they're going to be hearing from in that period is Donald Trump. The rest of it will be mediated through people like you and me and journalists and whatever. And we're so kind of siloed in our information ecosystem now that I honestly don't know what effect this is all going to have. And it's one of the big unknowns I think about next year. I just wonder how you're sort of thinking about that prospect as we head into next year.
It poses a tremendous challenge to you and I as reporters, but perhaps more so to news organizations. It's one, individual reporters will do what we can do, but how do you allocate resources and column inches and airtime to all of this? On one hand, these are going to be, and you're right. I think it's most likely that it's one trial, and it's the election interference case, the federal election interference case. It's an historic event. It's a trial that will be, studied in schools at all levels for decades to come. It's hugely consequential. But it's happening in the backdrop against the backdrop of a campaign, and one of the concerns I've had, and it's concerns about my own reporting as well, is that we spend so much time focusing on these cases, which deserve the attention that we give to them, and so little time in comparison to what Trump is actually thinking and what's in his head right now, and what his plans are, and what it would look like if he returned to the White House. I think that's changed a little bit in the last few weeks. I think, and I hope that this book that I've written has helped contribute in some way to that, and I hope it does. at least in the minds, not in terms of the coverage, but in terms of the minds of voters. It's like we need to, like, he's going to have the loudest megaphone on these cases. That's an excellent point. He's going to be the one you're going to be hearing from. Our voices, the voices of the reporters that are going to be in that courtroom every year, our voices are never going to be as loud. And we're going to be straight to the facts and down the line, and this is what happened. But, he's going to be what breaks through. And we need to be sure that, given that this is coming out against, playing out against the backdrop of a campaign, that we're also covering that campaign. And the court drama is not the campaign. I mean, Trump would like to make it as such, I think, but that's not the campaign.
Well, let's talk. I mean, until we get to audience questions, we've got about 8 minutes there. Let's spend this last little bit of time talking about looking ahead, and you get into this in your book. What does your reporting tell you about how a second Trump term in office might differ from his first term?
Well, and by the way, I'm incredibly honored that you're here with me, and we have a lot of conversations, over lunch, or see you on the campaign trail, or see whatever. I mean, it's great to have this conversation. You have done some phenomenal reporting really over the last few years about Trump and personnel, and the. There's two aspects of it. There's what happened especially at the tail end of his presidency, when John McEntee overtook the presidential personnel office. This young aide, he had just turned 30. He had never hired or fired anybody before, but he takes over presidential personnel in February of 2020, and presidential personnel is basically in charge of the hiring and firing of the 4,000 political appointees in the federal government. And he uses that office to begin, and he doesn't get very far in it. It's really just starting, but to try to weed out people in the administration that are insufficiently loyal to Donald Trump. His biggest crowning achievement is at the Pentagon after the election, when, McEntee orchestrates, it's fully doing Trump's bidding here, but McEntee is the one that carries it out. The decapitation of the entire political leadership at the Pentagon, or the top political leadership, starting with Defense Secretary Esper, and then puts in what are deemed the real loyalists. And you did that amazing reporting that, back in your Axios days, about how he also, sent over a directive, 4-line directive: get us out of Afghanistan, get us out of Syria and Iraq, get us out of Germany, and get us out of Somalia.
Yeah.
And then I take a dive into that story in this book to get the real gruesome details about how that directive came to be, and also the impact it had, and the way it was received at the Pentagon, and the way it was, the way they pulled the plug on it. But I had looked at McEntee and it had made a comment about him in a piece I had done for the Atlantic before Betrayal came out, as kind of the man who made January 6th possible. And what I meant by that is, he had gone through and, set a tone that loyalty was going to be the operating principle in that White House, which, by the way, it really hadn't been. I mean, there was so much infighting, made it good for, there was a lot of fodder for reporters to go, because you could always count on factions fighting back and forth. McEntee was there to kind of get rid of anybody who wasn't willing to, do anything that the boss wanted. So I think a second Trump term kind of starts where the first one left off, which is January 6th, because McEntee, and it doesn't need to be McEntee, by the way. It's like I say, it's McEntee or somebody like him will be going through and be sure. And I think you were the one that first highlighted this. There's a guy that worked for McEntee who had done some obscure podcast talking about, what he learned from presidential personnel and all that, and
Cluster.
Cluster. The most important thing that you can hire for is loyalty, not policy, because you can teach policy, but you can't teach loyalty. So in other words, we don't even care what these people believe in as long as they're loyal. So a second Trump term doesn't have the people who kind of offered some guardrails, maybe overrated guardrails, but some guardrails. I don't know if Jared Kushner is back. It looks like he's not, but who knows? Even if that changes, there's nobody like Bill Barr. There's nobody like Don McGahn or Pat Cipollone. There's nobody like Mattis or Tillerson or John Kelly. These people that were, serious people that were brought in and truly saw their sworn duty to abide by the Constitution, not the man. That's, I think, the most important thing to understand. And you've also reported about how they want to do this beyond just political appointees, but it's like the entire civil service, not the 4,000 political appointees, but the 40 or 50,000 civil servants who have, who serve from administration to administration. I mean, they want to get rid of those people as well.
And I think one thing that people don't always think about in this conversation is, he will come in, if he comes into power in 2025, there'll be a different judiciary than the judiciary that greeted him in 2017. It's a judiciary that Donald Trump himself largely shaped. He also figured out, and this from your reporting, they learned a lot over the 4 years.
Yeah.
I still find that there's this tendency to treat everyone around Trump like they're circus clowns. But actually, people like Stephen Miller, just take immigration as one example. The 2017, they did this botched travel ban that was, barely kind of written in a legible fashion. By the end, they'd virtually invalidated the asylum system. I mean, they'd learned a lot. I mean, it was actually a pretty sophisticated policy operation in certain areas by the end. And they learned a lot about how to wield power. They also learned a lot about how to abuse the nominating process. I mean, you talked about all these people that were overwhelmingly confirmed by the Senate. But by the end, he'd figured out how to use acting secretaries who were probably not confirmable. So I think that's another part of it that is really important to bear in mind, is that one way or another, Donald Trump is going to get the people he wants in key jobs. That's my view, having kind of fairly coldly assessed the situation.
So let me ask you a question, if you don't mind, then. So, because I think you're really onto something that's important and underappreciated by this, because Senate confirmation is a check on power. That's by design. And they did find the loopholes, but they did use and abide by the Vacancies Act, which allows you to put people in, and because you did have a White House counsel's office that was staffed by serious lawyers who felt it was their job to make sure that the president didn't violate the law. Kind of basic. So this is why, like, Rick Grinnell could be put in place as the director of national intelligence, in a rather absurd appointment, taking an internet troll and putting him in charge of the entire intelligence community. They were able to do that because he had been confirmed as ambassador to Germany. So he was able to serve, but just for a time. And, eventually you got a permanent replacement. There were limits, Matt Whitaker was in there just for a time as Attorney General. Eventually you get the more serious Bill Barr, who can be confirmed. If Trump decides just to go for acting secretaries, like across the board, what stops him?
The law is very poorly drafted and quite complicated. But as I understand it, what he can effectively get away with is you nominate someone, then you can withdraw their nomination. It's like 210 days. Basically, you can buy yourself something like 600 days with an acting. Like, if you really want to abuse the system and stretch it out, you get a lot of time out of these jobs. The other thing you can do is just put somebody, take someone like Kash Patel, who, even if it's a solid Republican Senate, this is who the guy Trump wanted to put in as deputy CIA director at the end of his first term, or deputy FBI. Bill Barr,
yeah, and he's all there were like 5 different jobs.
Yeah. Bill Barr said, "Over my dead body, will you do that?" So anyway, it didn't happen. And Kash Patel now is sort of stayed in Trump's orbit, writing, children's books that glorify Trump, whatever. Anyway, he's someone that even with a Republican Senate would be probably pretty hard to confirm. But let's say you put him in as deputy CIA director, a position that doesn't require Senate confirmation, but it's understood within the agency that he's in charge. This is the president's guy. He's in charge. But there's so many things you could do. And put him over at, the National Security Council and run things from there. I mean, there are just so many different permutations that, one thing I think you've learned, it's clear in your book, I've learned as well through this reporting, and we'll get to the questions in a sec, is I think what the Trump era has taught us is that so many of the quote unquote guardrails are not actually laws. They're norms.
They're customs
and they're customs and they're self-restraint and all these, like this sort of orchestra of, some laws, some norms. But when you have somebody who has no self-restraint and no intention of abiding by norms, the system's not set up to deal with that person. The laws are not set up to deal with that person. And in the last 3 years, Democrats, and to be fair, I guess they haven't really had the votes to do it, but they haven't passed any legislation to foreclose, to close any of these loopholes that Donald Trump identified. So the system hasn't actually been strengthened or bolstered during the Biden era. It's waiting for Donald Trump to come back to it in largely the same condition he left it.
Yeah, really, the only thing that was bolstered and reformed was the Electoral Count Act, to kind of make it abundantly clear that no, the vice president cannot unilaterally choose the next president.
But they didn't do anything with,
all the
Vacancies Act or any of these, confirmation. Okay.
And I know you want to go to questions, but
yeah.
So you're entirely correct. The question of norms and customs, but there's another thing that kind of haunts me. If Trump gets elected after all of this, he will have gotten away with everything, and he'll be president again. What if he just doesn't even go by the law either? What if he says, okay, that all your 270 days and all this electoral for the Vacancies Act? Well, he just says, you know what? That's my attorney general.
Right.
Now I know
you did the question of how do you enforce law?
The executive branch enforces the laws, right?
Totally.
So,
no, that's right. That's right.
And
that's right.
And this is so,
especially when you get into the question of like self pardons or ordering your DOJ to drop cases. I mean, all of this stuff.
By court orders. I mean, abiding by court orders.
It's all uncharted territory. It's all uncharted territory.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do a few audience questions. We'll probably have time for a couple. Do you believe Kash Patel's threat that Trump will come after reporters, or do you believe his campaign's distancing itself from that comment?
I mean, I don't really take that threat entirely seriously. It seemed like Kash Patel made that comment in an interview on The War Room with Steve Bannon. He was, and Bannon got them all. But it's sure as possible. I mean,
well, Trump himself has said he wants to go after Comcast and NBC and whatever.
I mean, and he said that. By the way, he said that some of that stuff in the 2016 campaign.
100%. And he didn't during his first term. Like he wanted to intervene with AT&T and CNN, but and Time Warner. He didn't. I guess my question. Let me rephrase that question a little bit. Trump did say some of this same stuff in 2016 and in his first term. He never really fully followed through with the media. It was rhetoric. Do you think it will be much the same in a second term, or do you think actually, no, he might operationalize it?
I mean, I think that we should fear that he could operationalize some of this. And I'll give you one very specific personal experience on this. I was president of the White House Correspondents Association in 2020. And the White House Correspondents Association, among our responsibilities, is to kind of handle the seating in the briefing room. And there's a reason for that. This gives some distance from the president to otherwise the president could be choosing, I want to have all my friends here and I want to kick everybody else out of the White House. And we fight and occasionally we'll go to court to fight for our ability to make sure that everybody has access. But a lot of this is customs and norms. So during COVID, you only had 14 seats in the briefing room, and Trump came to really resent that. And we rotated, so all different news organizations could get in and out. But he resented it when he would go out there and he would see me, he would see Phil Rucker, he would see maybe Maggie Haberman, he would see whoever. He really resented that he was seeing like actual journalists and not, 14 Sean Hannity clones in the briefing room. And they put a lot of pressure on me, which I did not abide by, and I didn't bow to, to put friendly voices, and it almost came to a crisis. I mean, there was a moment where they, there was one moment that where they wanted to pull Caitlin Collins, who was CNN White House reporter at the time, out of the briefing room in the middle of a briefing, one of those COVID briefings. There was a moment where they tried to put somebody else in the front row when OAN and the Secret Service was brought in, and we all, like as a press corps, like basically stood up and prevented it from happening. But I mean, once again, this will be from day one. Are they going to be pulling credentials? Are they going to be, we'll go to court to fight it again? But I mean, who knows? That's just one level. The other level that you're getting at, will he actually go and try to punish this? Is there a room for Jonathan Swan at Gitmo? I mean, there's certainly going to be people around him who, if you believe the rhetoric of what he's actually saying, the enemy of the people, what do you do with the enemy of the people?
Let's move on to another question. While conducting the interviews for this book, was there anything that you heard or learned that truly surprised or shocked you?
There were a number of things, but I have to say that the thing that really shocked me was the extent to which he believed he could be reinstated as president. And I know there's a big debate, and Jack Smith is making the case that Trump knew he lost. And here I am saying he actually believed he could be reinstated. Does that contradict what's being said? I not necessarily. I think that his awareness of his leaving reality was a process, but the idea that an ex-president really thought there was a way that he could go back to the White House short of another election, I think is really shocking.
There's a question here that they say, who do you think are the leaders of the GOP? But I'd like to use my moderator's my power, my great power to rephrase that. Your subtitle, if I'm not mistaken, is something to the effect of the end of the GOP.
The end of the Grand Old Party.
The Grand Old Party.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that. When you say the end of the Grand Old Party, what do you mean by that?
It's the way that Donald Trump has been able to methodically remake the Republican Party in his own image. This is not the party anymore of Ronald Reagan, of the Bushes, John McCain, Mitt Romney. And it's not so much substance and policy. There is some policy in there, a move towards isolationism, protectionism, broad brushstrokes, harder line on immigration. Okay. But not a lot of specifics behind any of that. This is never really truly about policy. It's about orienting the party towards the whims of one man. And you see the wreckage that he has left in his wake. I mean, I think there is one thing that was interesting in Liz Cheney's book. She writes about the message that she got from George W. Bush, cheering her on and talking about the importance of her work when she stood up to Trump. Bush hasn't done that for the most part. He stayed silent in Dallas, and he's done charity work and done some good stuff, and he's worked on his painting. But I don't think it's because he's afraid to. I think that he gets a sense that it would only backfire, that it wouldn't help. I don't know if he's right about that, but I think that's a calculation. I don't even know for sure if that's his thinking, but that's my read of it. I mean, this party has left those people behind, and it is, and it's become Trump's party. Now, I don't think it's irreversible. And this would be, maybe we come together and do another one of these we'll come out and do something in person in San Francisco. We can talk about this and go back and forth. I think it's possible that he loses the nomination still. I don't think that's a given, even though it sure seems that way right now. But I don't think that it's inconceivable that he loses this nomination. And then there's a real reckoning within the party about what to do and where it goes. I also think that it's not just him anymore. The drama that's played out in the House over the, McCarthy's, saga to become speaker, the way he got jettisoned. And I mean, all of this is Trump's party, and yet he had virtually no role in any of it directly. But it were all of his, most diehard acolytes who have carried this about.
I mean, what's really interesting is, while the institution, the institutional GOP is not particularly recognizable from 10 years ago, in some other ways, it's a healthier party in terms of its appeal among Hispanic voters.
Yeah.
They're doing better. Donald Trump is doing vastly better among Hispanics than Mitt Romney ever did.
Yeah.
He's doing much better among African Americans than Mitt Romney ever did. It's becoming more of a working class party. And it's just an interesting kind of contradiction when you have Donald Trump being the accelerant of the diversification of the Republican base. It's like, and I just wonder how you think about that phenomenon, because it is part of the story of the last 5-6 years.
Yeah. And he's been a turnout machine. I mean, this is one thing that he rants about when he talks about the election being stolen from him. He got, what was it, 74 million votes, 73 million. And he was told that if he got 68, I may have the numbers slightly off, right. But something like that, he vastly outperformed what his own people were saying what their targets would be. Of course, he's also been an incredible turnout machine for Democrats.
Right.
And the way women have fled the Republican parties, the way suburban voters have fled Trump's Republican Party. But there is no question. He has the numbers on Hispanics are significant. The numbers on African American men, really almost entirely men, still the vast majority voting Democrat. But
Hispanics is almost even now. It's really amazing. And the youth, who knows if this will play out in the election, but
right.
The way he's closed the gap on the youth vote is there's something going on there that I still feel like we don't really have our hands around, in terms of the electorate right now. And
it's something that the Democrats should be terrified about and should be doing a lot of soul searching about. What is it that have caused Democrats to, because I don't know how much of it is, a great appeal to Trump or frustration with the message that is coming from the Democrats.
Right.
Something's not working.
Last question. Covering the news can be exciting and stressful. What is the best part of your job? What is the most challenging?
The best part of the job is having a chance to watch history unfold and to be there and to, be able to put questions to the powerful and to always learn something every single day. That's our job. Jonathan and I, our job is to wake up in the morning and learn something new. How great is that? The worst part of the job is you have no control over your life. Let's make plans. What are we going to do? You want to, whether it's trying to make dinner plans or vacation plans, you can be sure, especially when you're covering the White House. I did that for about basically full time for about a decade. And any news, not just news out of the White House, but any news in the world, you have to get the White House reaction. You need to be on you need to be right there. So that's, but we are very fortunate to have these jobs, and I know I love it. I know Jonathan Swan loves it, and you're an Australian. I'm an American. I think we both kind of feel that reverence when you walk into the White House, when you walk into the Capitol, when you walk by the Supreme Court, and you realize that you have what these institutions represent, which is also what made January 6th and all that surrounded January 6th so personally painful, to see those institutions that I've had such reverence for under assault and really teetering, was really painful to watch, and remains painful to watch.
Well, thank you, Jonathan Karl, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. I mean this sincerely. I really encourage you, if you haven't already, to buy this book, Tired of Winning: Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party. It tells you so much about this period that I do think in 20 years' time, when, Jonathan and I are, arthritic, we'll be looking back and looking at this period as one of the most important turning points in American history. And Jonathan's done so much to fill out that first draft. So I really encourage you to buy the book. At your local bookstore, Amazon, wherever you buy books, do the audio version. And if you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Jonathan Swan. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.